So they said, look, we've got a major problem. We need a reagent to do the COVID testing. So they needed what's called a lysis buffer reagent, which isolates the virus, isolates the COVID virus. And they said, look, would you be able to develop this? And I said, okay, well, look, you're going to have to give me 24 hours in this one. I'll go off and sit down with one or two of my partners, and we'll see, one, if we can find the ingredients to make it, and two, if we're able to make it. So we were in the throes of growing our own business around COVID-19, but this was certainly one for the green jersey it's at the end of the day, we're talking about Irish patients in Irish hospitals, an Irish problem, and potentially we were able to solve it for them.
The Architects of Business, with EY Entrepreneur of the Year, telling the inspirational stories behind Ireland's most successful entrepreneurs.
Hello and welcome to the Architects of Business, made in partnership with EY Entrepreneur of the Year, where you will hear the inspirational stories of some of Ireland's most successful entrepreneurs. I'm Sonya Lennon, broadcasting remotely from my home at this time. And on this week's show, I chat with Philip Noone, the CEO of Aalto Bio, an Irish biotech company who are at the forefront of the race to find vaccines for COVID-19. Their reagents are already being used for COVID tests all around the world. If you haven't already done so, click subscribe to get shows directly into your feed. Philip Noone, CEO of Aalto Bio. It's a real honour and privilege to have you on the show today, not least because you are a gentleman who has taken one day off since March, which is a real testament of how hard you and your company are working at the moment. You're at the coalface of tackling the effects of COVID-19 and trying to create a vaccine. Your work is phenomenal, but I think in the true tradition of Architects of Business, let's start at the beginning and work up to quite an extraordinary crescendo. Mm-hmm. You came from a very large family in Dublin, am I right?
That's right, yeah. Youngest of a family of 10, which was it's pretty unusual in growing up in South County Dublin. But I guess I was fighting for my place on the team at a very young age, and continue that all the way through. Youngest is of a group of 10, kind of gets you fighting for the front at a very early age, which is a good thing.
I guess it can either go one way or the other, and you took the baton and run with it. It's really interesting looking back at your story and seeing that from a very young age, science was really front and center.
Yeah, it's I don't know whether that was luck or whether it was in the DNA, but certainly three of my family are involved in the medical game. My mother was a nurse, worked in the Mater Hospital, originally from Galway, and I guess as I was talking about this recently, one of the things that kind of stood out for me is when a lot of my friends were heading off to Irish college. I actually had a science teacher in my younger years that obviously saw something that I didn't see in my teenage years, and advised that I go off to a ecology course, believe it or not, in Buttevant in Cork in my earlier days. And I think that's when it really opened up the door to me. Through that summer in teenage years, I got a real interest in science and had a real grow for it. And I never lost that ever since, which is kind of interesting.
And yet, explain to me why you went on after school to study international marketing.
Yeah, it was a case of, in my younger years, my father passed away at a very young age. I was 4 when he passed away. So my mother was left managing a team of 10 on her own. And the opportunity came my way when I left school to get a fully ESF paid up grant towards doing the international marketing, or go down the science route and have to pay for it myself, or try and find that funds at that stage. And that was really the decision there at that stage. I never lost the interest in science, but it was a case of must and have. So I went down that route towards international marketing. And funny enough, my first role out of college was in a science-based organization. no, I don't know how that lined up either, which was a startup out of Mount Marion in the virus area. So I kind of fell, I kind of went off the pitch for a year or two down the marketing route, and then came back fully into the science sphere again.
So let's talk about that startup you joined out of college then.
Yeah, so it was a startup based out of Marion, headed up by a guy, he's a guy called Cormac Kilty. Cormac's like one of the godfathers of biotechnology. Within Ireland, and I mean, he took me on as either his second or third hire, with the objective of looking at the globe commercially to see where we could go with a product. We hadn't got the product built at that stage. The product was for parvovirus B19, which was probably one of the first diagnostic. It was the first diagnostic test for parvovirus B19 for detecting parvo, and my role was basically to set up all the channel distribution partnerships around Europe, and then as the product got FDA approved, then move into the US and look at capturing that market.
That can't have been an easy journey to get that approval.
Absolutely not. But I mean, it was also at a time when startups weren't as in vogue as they are now. I mean, the funding from EI wasn't available at that stage where you could get match funding. There was no VCs around, there's no VC houses around at the stage. So the company was basically run on an overdraft for quite a number of the first few years, and you're literally living hand to mouth, trying to make the sales to pay for salaries and pay for everything else, but also trying to grow the business and grow the product side of it. So it was a pretty good learning curve in terms of building a self-sufficient startup in Ireland from scratch, 2 or 3 of us to start with. By the time I left, it was at about 68 people there and a revenue, under 10 million. So it was quite phenomenal growth once all the channel distribution was set up and the products were starting to flow. But it started from very humble beginnings.
So how long did you spend at Biotron watching it grow to this enormous entity, this world leader?
Yeah, so it's the first 2 years it was because we were kind of working hand to foot. I was probably there over a 6 to 7 year period as it grew from strength to strength. I then got approached by probably one of the biggest diagnostic companies in the world, Quest Diagnostics, who approached me to say, look, we want you to come in and head up our in vitro products division. And Quest was a whole different ball game because I kind of moved from a startup Irish company, living hand to mouth, moving to one of the biggest US companies around at the time. I think they had 4,000 or 5,000 employees. They were at $1 billion turnover. And they had, the way Quest operates is they have about 30 reference labs throughout each of the US states. They have 1 or 2 in France. They've 1 in London. And what they do is they try and diagnose these viruses or diseases that are unidentifiable. So if a patient turns up in Kentucky tomorrow, goes into their their doctor and they can't diagnose it, normally that sample will come back to Quest. We then tried to develop a test to diagnose that. So we would develop a test inside 2 weeks to try and diagnose that disease. And then over a 6-month period, we develop a diagnostic test to try and diagnose the disease. So my plan with Quest was probably, okay, let's continue the learning curve here. We'll probably spend 5 or 6 years here, have a look at how this organization operates and how they build products. But I ended up staying 12 years.
What was your title role when you? Sorry, Philip. What was your title role when you moved into Quest?
So they took me on originally as sort of head of business development, in vitro diagnostics, head of the in vitro diagnostic business development. But really what I was doing was to try and box up those viruses, if you like, and make them over-the-counter products to laboratories and hospitals around the globe. And through my time there, I probably developed about 59 different products in the infectious disease area. So products like our diseases, viruses like coronavirus, were very much in my basket in terms of developing fast diagnostic tests that could try and earlier diagnose them. So one or two of the ones that I worked on when I was there, one was H1N1. You probably remember the H1N1 outbreak in 2008, 2009. So we developed a diagnostic test to try and identify that virus. Reason being, we got a phone call from one of our labs down in Mexico to say, look, we have a new virus here. It's not showing up on any of the tests that we have. We don't know what it is. So we sent a team down there, brought back an aliquot of the virus, if you like, and went to work on it and built a test for it inside 2 weeks. And then that test was used within the US to diagnose all of the potential H1N1 cases. So, there were some pretty groundbreaking tests developed throughout that time there. But the company also developed at a fairly substantial rate. When I joined in 98, was it 98 or 99? It was at about $1 billion turnover. When I left in 2012-13, it was at 8 billion turnover. So it was a pretty phenomenal growth.
And how do you position your role within that growth personally?
Well, I can't take credit for all of it, but it was a really interesting time, and it was kind of, there was no, I think working within a US organization like that it runs on its own. It runs on its own capital, basically. It's not looking for outside VC. It's not looking for any you're not going to the markets. If you have a good idea, you're selling it internally to a senior management team, basically. And once the sign off is given, the product goes ahead. All the powers that be, all of the R&D teams, etc., plug in fully to develop the product and get fully behind it. So you see a product come to fruition a lot quicker, as long as the methodology and the whole reasoning behind the market for it makes sense.
Is sound.
Correct, yeah.
And so this little journey to understand the mechanism of a huge global player in the market was supposed to be a little tip and dip and see what happens. How long did you end up staying at Quest?
Yeah, so I was there in total 12, almost 13 years in total when I look at it from start to finish. But it was, every day was fun. It was like some days where, you weren't sleeping through the night developing product. And, there was a real drive to get the products out. I worked with some seriously talented people over there who are now running some of the top companies in the US, some of the top IVD companies like Diagnostics, like Thermo Fisher. They're run by colleagues of mine that worked in that team with me. And I think, the ideas were great, but it was the kind of boardroom that when you stepped into it, it was one board meeting. I think I can tell this story, without any confidentiality. It was one particular board meeting. We were looking at logistics, and at that time we were spending 300 million a year. That was our billing to FedEx for the shipments that they were moving around the States and around the globe for us. And one of my colleagues, sort of came up with a brainstorm during the board meeting and said, why don't we set up our own logistics company internally? And it was said to him, yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't you go away, build a strategic plan and come back to us, which he did. And, we went on to purchase 10 737s and hire pilots to fly those 737s. And his job then was COO of the logistics division to run it, because he came up with the idea. And that's still operational now. So Quest, funnily enough, is the fourth largest logistics carrier in the US, all because of one person's idea to try and bring that in-house and backward integrate it.
So you're 13 years now at Quest. You've learned a massive amount. You've transferred your knowledge from the sort of struggling startup into the global player. What happened next is a great part of your story. Were you already thinking about how you could use the knowledge and experience that you had for your own company, or did the approach come first?
That's a great question. In my mind, I guess my next move wasn't going to be into a big corporate again, because you know, I guess through developing 59 different products at Quest, I brought a lot of success to that company. Um, it's a shareholder-owned company that was already set up way before I joined them. So my idea in my own mind was, the next company that I was going to be involved in would definitely be, I'd certainly be driving the ship, as opposed to, sitting at the top table, bringing advice and developing new products in that area. So I guess I was approached then by a group of investors, Irish investors, that said, look, we have a company here. We certainly would like to take it global, and we'd like you to come in and take the thing over. So from that discussion, I kind of built a strategic plan, had a look at the business, had a look at where I was at, had a look at to see where I could bring it, had a look to see where the new areas I could bring it into, and kind of wrote my strategic plan for 6 months to a year, I would say, before I actually sat around the table and said, right, okay, let's sit down. I think we can do something here. And then we pulled a plan together in 2014, and I went in to buy Alto with a group of investors. So we bought the company.
So what did Alto look like when you got to it?
Alto was a success. It always has been. It's been generating cash from day one. The original founders, two brothers from Rathfarnham, did a great job, getting it to where it was at when I acquired it in 2014. They had a couple of household name companies that they were involved in making critical raw materials for them. But I just saw a lot more scale there, and I saw a lot more product potential in terms of developing new products in areas that they hadn't even touched on, really. So it was a successful business in its own right. The scaffolding was there. It was a case of, putting the extra 2 layers of scaffolding up, and putting an extra set of wings on the jumbo at 30,000 feet, is how I would describe it. So that's what we've been doing since 2014. But certainly, I had a strategic plan in line when I went to buy the company in 2014.
So I'm gonna see what the themes are now, and how it stacks up. What multiple of the revenue in 2014 are you now running at annually?
So we're just under, let me see, we're 3x, nearly 4x revenue now since I took it over in 2014. So we've gone to almost four times revenue in that space of 4 or 5 years. And
you are literally you're at the coal face of COVID-19 now.
Yeah. So obviously I was tracking COVID-19 very carefully, looking at new viruses. We've been working on Zika virus, we've been working on dengue and chikungunya. We were one of the first companies to develop a raw material for Zika virus in 2016 and 17 when the outbreak happened in Brazil. And when that outbreak happened, we were fortunate enough to have a material there that all the major diagnostic companies could use. So overnight we were our customer base trebled, and it went from some of the players in Europe, some of the diagnostic players in Europe, and one or two in the US, to all the major diagnostic companies in Europe, all the major players in the US, all the major pharmaceutical companies that had visions to build a vaccine and a diagnostic for Zika virus were plugged into us. Now that had its own challenges in terms of having the manpower to be able to deal with all the orders and deal with everything else that goes with that. And it was a good learning curve for all the team to be able to cope with that. But I think that has stood well for us now, because all of those big companies, the likes of Siemens, Roche, Abbott, we deal with them all. And I think, we're kind of, back of their minds now when in January, the Chinese, basically started talking about, talking in detail about the virus itself. And then once we got our hands on the sequence for the virus, we worked to develop a protein for it. And again, we were one of the first companies with a protein available for for diagnosing COVID-19. So we developed the nucleocapsid protein, which a lot of the scientific papers at the start were saying is the one you should use to try and diagnose it. And lo and behold, we're back where we were in 2016, 17. All the diagnostic companies wanted our material. All the pharmaceutical companies wanted it. But we haven't sat on our hands. Because if you look at COVID-19, you hear about antibodies and proteins and, you know, all these different, you know, terminologies that a lot of people wouldn't be familiar with. But the interesting thing with the virus is you really, to diagnose it, there's 3 or 4 different parts of the protein that you need to look at. So we looked at the nucleocapsid part of the protein. You also need to look at the S1 part of the protein and the S2, and, you know, and the RBD part of the protein. So there's probably 4 types you need to really look at. So we developed the N part of the protein, and now we've developed the S1, the S2, and the RBD. That's all going on behind the scenes. So very quickly, we're going to have a portfolio of materials for diagnosing COVID that nobody else really has in Europe.
So to put that into lay terms, then you're talking about having a sort of a 360 tool that can look at this problem from every angle.
Correct. Yeah. So okay. you could see, you know, what has happened here is, interestingly enough, there's about 160 vaccine companies trying to work on vaccines for COVID-19, and there's probably in the region of 300 to 400 diagnostic companies trying to develop diagnostic tests. Now, one can't work without the other, because you need to be able to diagnose it correctly in order to be able to treat it correctly with the correct vaccine. And, you know, to get that clinical picture, that total clinical picture, you need to be looking at all parts of the protein in order to, or the key parts of the protein, in order to be able to diagnose it correctly. So a lot of the earlier tests that came on the market in the outbreak in February, March, and April probably moved a little bit too quickly. If you think if you think logically with diagnostic products, it can take anywhere from 6 months to 12 months to develop it, do the clinical trials. If you're building it too fast and putting it onto the market, you're kind of learning as you go along, which isn't the ideal scenario. And, you know, I think Abbott were one of those examples that they put a test out a little bit too early, and then, you know, the science labs that were running it were saying, hold on, we're not diagnosing all the patients that are coming through with clinical symptoms. So, you know, what's going on? And they've had to go back to the drawing board now and relook at it. And that's where I'm talking about the 3 or 4 different parts of the protein that you need to look at in a whole shot in order to get a complete picture on it.
So you started hearing the mumbles in January from China, and I suspect at that point you knew something big was coming. Why did COVID-19 take hold like nothing else?
For me, there's 1 or 2 factors here that are really driving this. And look, I've worked in these viruses for 25 years, but they've normally stayed in the tropics. A lot of these viruses have stayed in the tropics. So if you think of SARS, it mainly kind of stayed in China, Korea, you know, Singapore, in those markets. And if I think back to 2009, you know, in 2009, we didn't have as many airplanes in the sky. We didn't have as many people traveling around the place, freely moving, you know, from capital to capital, you know, on low budget airlines, and moving country to country very quickly. So it was, I would argue, easier to contain a virus like this in the markets it was present in. Whereas, you know, with this virus, you know, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories as to how it moved across, but you had a lot of free movement of people from China into Europe, and the other way around, from Europe back into China. So I think the spread of the virus has caught everybody, you know, unawares in terms of the speed that it's moved from country to country. But China and Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong and these countries are very good at you know, identifying a virus like this, monitoring the virus by, you know, population. They do in-community testing very quickly, and they come up with problematic areas and shut them down very quickly. We have never done this in Europe before. We're not used to it, and I think that's why it spread very quickly over here. But, you know, hopefully we'll get better at managing disease management through better diagnostics. With a virus like this, or, you know, if any of its sister viruses appear over the next number of years.
You took a call in March that really changed the direction of how the company was going to approach this. Sort of when COVID had exploded onto the scene and was very much front and center in Ireland. What happened at that point?
Yeah, that was a pretty interesting phone call for me. So, I mean, if you think about Alto, we're 95% export. We do very little business in Ireland. Most of our, disease markets are global. All of these emerging diseases, as I said, are in emerging markets, and that's where we concentrate a lot of our business. But we're in the throes of COVID. If you can imagine, in March, we're trying to, basically all of the comms team are, trying to deeply research the virus, see if we've got all the strains, if we're looking at the right area, what else we need to develop in order to get the full picture for a clinical diagnostic test with our partners in Europe and the US. And then I got a phone call on a Friday night. I can't remember which day it was in March, but it was a Friday night anyway, because I remember taking the call and taking it in my front room, and it was a senior figure from the HSE saying this was at the time when reagents were front and center on the news. I mean, Leo was on the news every night talking about we've got a problem with reagents. We've got a really big problem. We can't do the testing. We want to go from 5,000 tests to 25,000 tests a day, and they contacted me smartly enough. They got my details from one of the board members in Alto, who then reached out to me and said, look, would you be willing to take a call? And I said, yeah, look, I'll take a call from them, sure. And they said, okay, look, we've got a major problem. We're trying to do this COVID testing, but we can't get the reagents because this very large company based in Switzerland is not able to provide us with the materials, because obviously the US and the UK had turned on at that point, and they weren't willing to, or maybe through commercial reasons, they probably weren't able to supply Ireland. So any of the orders that had been placed were getting pushed out 3 and 4 and 5 months. So they said, look, we've got a major problem. We need a reagent to do the COVID testing. So they needed what's called a lysis buffer reagent, which isolates the virus, isolates the COVID virus. And they said, look, would you be able to develop this? And I said, okay, well, look, you're going to have to give me 24 hours in this one. I'll go off and sit down with 1 or 2 of my partners, and we'll see, one, if we can find the ingredients to make it, and 2, if we're able to make it. So we were in the throes of growing our own business around COVID-19, but this was certainly one for the green jersey it's at the end of the day, we're talking about Irish patients in Irish hospitals, an Irish problem, and potentially we were able to solve it for them. So, the next 3 or 4 days I spent a few sleepless nights, and a lot of research brought me back to my college days to see if we could first locate the key ingredients to build the reagent that was required to isolate COVID-19, and then 2, to see if we could do it in a very short time. So we identified the materials, we brought them in, we developed a prototype reagent within 7 days. We had it in our National Virus Reference Centre within 2 weeks. And then we did a full-scale build of the product at the beginning of April. So inside 3 or 4 weeks, we had concepted a product, designed a product, tested a product, and had it on the Irish market. So that went out to all the 20 reference, or the 20 COVID testing centres around Ireland to isolate the virus, to allow the test centres to be able to run the tests.
And to put that in context, Philip, what would be the normal life cycle of getting a product to market like that?
Well, if I go back to my Quest days, I mean, I think I'd get laughed out of the boardroom if I said I'd concept a product and develop it inside 4 weeks and have it on the market within 4 weeks and test it. So normally a life cycle for a product like that, you're looking at 12 to 15 months by the time you develop the product, build it, test it in the market, do your trials on it. So this was really at warp speed in terms of getting it developed and bringing it to market. But I'm kind of proud of the company and proud of what we did, and also being able to help out an Irish problem that was at the end of the day, it was going to help out with Irish lives and diagnosing this virus earlier and getting the patient samples run a little bit earlier as well.
So your focus on testing should not diminish the fact that you are working hand in glove with a major player for the vaccine.
Correct. Yeah. So we're working with, I mean, if you look at the way, I mentioned those 160 vaccine companies that are working on the vaccine development at the moment. In my mind, there's 2 or 3 that are ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve. And 2 of those are Inovio and Moderna. Moderna have done their phase 2 clinical trials. You do obviously 3 phases of clinical trials before you bring the product to market. They've done their first 2 phases. They're in their 3rd phase. And they're probably moving at a speed faster than anybody else. So we've been working hand in hand with them, helping them with their clinical trials in order to get a vaccine on the market faster. And we're happy to be able to work with them. And we're also working with 1 or 2 German vaccine developers to help them on the European front to develop a vaccine for COVID-19 as well. So if you like, we're working in tandem with the diagnostic companies to diagnose it. We're also working with the vaccine developers who are going to have the ultimate solution to be able to treat people with it.
So you donned your superhero cape to get the reagent product to market to save Ireland. Now I want you to whip out your crystal ball and in one line tell us how long, in your opinion, we'll have to wait for a vaccine.
Okay, so I've got a fairly good insight on this because I'm working with 1 or 2 of the companies that are actually developing the vaccine.
I should hope so.
But best case scenario is end of the year. So look, I've been intimately involved in the phase 2 clinical trials. So I think they've done quite well with that. They already have an order from the US government. The US government have already pre-ordered the vaccine, even though it's not developed, which is is quite a new phenomenon for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. But we're looking probably at the end of the year is a best guess for a vaccine availability. Now, whether that's available in the US only, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a US-based company, but there could be a lot of people flying.
Sure, we have your number now, Philip. We'll give you a direct call.
Yeah. So best case scenario is the end of the year. Worst case scenario is the earlier part of 2021, depending on how the phase 3 clinical trials. But what I've seen in phase 2, I'd be fairly confident that they're going to have something pretty good available by the end of the year, which is good news for all of us and all businesses, I would think.
It certainly is, Philip, and really optimistic for all our listeners and beyond. I guess we have to talk a little bit about EY. I mean, the network, although it is a very supportive network, it's more than that to you. I think a number of the alumni are really embedded in the work that you do with Alto.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, when I went on the journey with EY last year, I mean, the whole experience start to finish it's one of the best programs I've been involved in. And the reason I say that, I mean, I don't say that fairly flippantly. The reason I would say that is some of the business leaders that are in the EY alumni are, they're household name business leaders in Ireland that have built very, very successful companies and continue to grow them. And being able to link in with that kind of network, just troubleshooting ideas that you have in your own business is phenomenal, whether that be on a financial part or whether that be on a day-to-day business operations part. I think it's an incredible network. But also 1 or 2 of the existing alumni are also business partners of ours. So we have one of the alumni runs our IT group for us, which we contract out, and they've been extremely supportive as particularly in COVID, as we've moved a lot of people off site. And then there's other business leaders in there in the life science space whom I jump back and forth with, both with ideas on their business and ideas on my business, and other leaders in the finance space as well, which are invaluable as we continue to grow and expand the businesses at Alto. So for me, it's an extraordinary organization and really a great network to be involved in.
Philip, from my point of view, I'm just very glad that you went through that EY Entrepreneur of the Year journey last year to give you time to free up this year to do the really hard work at high speed. Philip Noone, thank you so much for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule, and we're really looking forward to watching your journey. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonya.
Thanks for listening and watching Architects of Business, made in partnership with EY Entrepreneur of the Year. Thanks to all the team here at JOE, and of course to our entrepreneur today, Philip Noone. If you haven't already done so, click subscribe to get brand new shows directly into your feed.